The thermometer plummeted to 20 below zero, freezing the sap in the pines until they snapped like gunshots. Inside a hand-built cabin on Miller's Ridge, 16-year-old Cora Higgins sat by a roaring fire. She wasn't supposed to survive the winter, but she had a secret, and she had a plan. The October wind ripping off Lake Coeur d'Alene carried the unmistakable bite of early snow. Standing on the porch of the only home she had ever known, 16-year-old Cora Higgins watched her stepfather, Arthur Caldwell, slide the heavy brass deadbolt into place. The metallic click echoed like a judge's gavel. "You've got no claim here, Cora." Arthur's voice was muffled through the heavy oak door, lacking even an ounce of the fake warmth he had maintained while her mother was alive. "The house is in my name now. The bank is foreclosing, and I'm liquidating. Go find an aunt. Go find a shelter. But you're not staying here." Her mother's funeral had been barely 48 hours ago. Abigail Caldwell had died of a sudden, brutal bout of pneumonia, leaving Cora alone with a man whose gambling debts were an open secret in their small Idaho town. Arthur had wasted no time. The moment the dirt was settled over Abigail's grave, the eviction had begun. Cora stood shivering in a faded denim jacket, her breath pluming in the frigid air. At her feet sat a heavy, waxed canvas logger's backpack. It belonged to her biological father, Thomas Higgins, a man who had spent his life in the deep timberlands before a logging accident took his life when Cora was just 9. Arthur had thrown the bag out the door, laughing at its ragged condition, completely unaware of what it truly held. She didn't cry. The shock had frozen the tears inside her chest. Cora slung the heavy canvas straps over her shoulders, the weight of the old steel tools clanking dully against her spine. She walked away from the manicured lawn, down the gravel driveway, and didn't look back. Cora walked 3 miles to the Greyhound bus station on the edge of town, the neon lights buzzing weakly against the encroaching dusk. She had exactly $14 to her name. Huddling on a cracked vinyl bench, dodging the suspicious glances of the station manager, she opened the canvas bag. Inside was her father's legacy: a broad axe, a hand-forged draw knife, a crosscut saw, a heavy wool blanket, and a tarnished silver Waltham pocket watch. Thomas had handed her that watch in the hospital. His breathing labored. "Never sell it, Cora Bird," he had wheezed, his rough hand gripping hers, "no matter how hungry you get. The time has stopped, but the compass still points true." Cora held the heavy silver timepiece in her numb fingers. The hands were permanently frozen at 4:15. She pressed the release latch, not for the front face, but for the intricate silver backing. It popped open with a quiet hiss. Hidden inside the casing, folded into an impossibly tight square, was a piece of yellowed, wax-sealed parchment. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it. It was a land patent, a deed, 40 acres of unorganized territory on the north face of Miller's Ridge, granted to Thomas Higgins. Attached to it was a hand-drawn topographical map and a note scrawled in pencil: "For my girl. When the wolves come to the door, head for the high timber. The foundation is laid. The rest is yours." Arthur didn't know about this. He thought Thomas had died penniless, leaving behind only debts. If Arthur knew about 40 acres of untouched prime Douglas fir timberland, he would have dragged Cora back to court and forged her signature to sell it. Miller's Ridge was 30 miles away, deep in the Bitterroot Mountains. It was rugged, unforgiving wilderness, accessible only by a neglected logging road that washed out every spring. The locals avoided it, claiming the ridge was cursed with phantom downdrafts and winters so brutal they could freeze a running river overnight. But for a 16-year-old girl with nowhere to go and a predator at her back, it was the only sanctuary left. With her meager funds, Cora bought a one-way ticket to a rusted-out gas station sitting at the foothills of the Bitterroots. The bus driver, an older man with kind eyes, gave her a long look as she stepped off into the freezing rain. "Ain't nothing up that road but bears and bad weather, kid," he warned. "I know," Cora said, adjusting the heavy straps. "I'm meeting family." The trek up the mountain was a brutal test of endurance. For 2 days, Cora hiked through dense, dripping pine forests, the elevation gain burning her lungs. She slept beneath the dense canopy of ancient cedars, wrapped in her father's wool blanket, chewing on stale crackers she'd bought at the gas station. Every snap of a twig sounded like Arthur coming to find her. Every howl of the wind sounded like a warning. By the afternoon of the third day, the temperature plummeted drastically. The rain turned to sleet, stinging her face like shattered glass. She was navigating entirely by her father's hand-drawn map, counting landmarks, a split boulder, a lightning-struck oak, a creek bed dry of water but full of smooth white stones. Finally, just as the last light of the sun bled out of the bruised purple sky, she broke through a thicket of blackberry brambles and stepped into a clearing. It wasn't much. The 40 acres were breathtaking, towering pines scraping the sky, but the foundation her father had mentioned was nothing more than a square of massive, moss-covered river stones. A few rotted bottom logs lay crumbling into the earth, remnants of a trapper's cabin that had fallen apart decades ago. Standing in the center of the ruins, the isolation finally hit her. She was 16. She was utterly alone. Winter was weeks away, and if she didn't get a roof over her head and a fire burning, she would be dead before Thanksgiving. Cora dropped the heavy canvas bag. She pulled out the broad axe, the steel edge gleaming in the twilight. She didn't have time to cry. She had to build. The first week on Miller's Ridge was a masterclass in agony. Cora's hands, previously accustomed only to school books and household chores, blistered, popped, and calloused over. The muscles in her back screamed with every swing of her father's axe. She focused on survival with a ruthless, singular focus. The footprint of her father's old stone foundation was too large for her to build upon, alone, about 20 by 20 feet. Instead, she decided to build a smaller, tighter structure inside the original stone square. A 10 by 12-foot cabin, just big enough to sleep in and retain heat. She spent her daylight hours felling straight, relatively slender lodgepole pines. She couldn't lift massive logs, so she cut them into manageable 10-foot sections, dragging them through the brush with a makeshift harness she rigged from her backpack straps. Using the draw knife, she stripped the bark to prevent rot and pests, leaving the pale, raw wood exposed to the crisp mountain air. She learned by doing, failing, and trying again. She notched the corners using saddle joints, a technique her father had sketched in the margins of his map. The walls rose agonizingly slowly, 1 log a day, then 2, then 3, as she found her rhythm. For chinking, she waded into the freezing creek at the edge of the property, digging up thick, heavy blue clay and mixing it with dried pine needles and dead grass. She packed the mud tightly between the logs, sealing out the biting wind. But the walls and a roof of overlapping, hand-split cedar shakes wouldn't keep her alive. The true test of the cabin and her life would be the chimney. A stove made of cast iron would have been ideal, but Cora had no money and no way to haul a 200-pound stove up a mountain. She had to build a fireplace and chimney entirely from stone and clay. If she built it wrong, the cabin would fill with toxic smoke and suffocate her in her sleep. If the draft wasn't strong enough, the fire wouldn't burn hot enough to combat the -20 blizzards the Bitterroots were infamous for. She turned to her father's notebook. Thomas had written extensively about masonry. The secret to a mountain fire, his messy handwriting read, is the throat and the smoke shelf. Narrow it down right above the firebox, then expand it. The cold air pushes down, hits the shelf, and gets pulled right back up by the hot air. That's your engine. Cora became a scavenger. She hauled smooth, heat-resistant river stones from the dry creek bed, carrying them 3 at a time against her chest, until her jacket was torn and her skin bruised black and blue. She built the firebox deep and wide, using the thickest mud mixture to cement the stones together. Building the chimney stack was terrifying. She had to construct a wooden scaffolding from scrap branches, balancing precariously as she stacked stones higher and higher, tapering the flue exactly as the diagram showed. As November crept in, the air turned vicious. Frost coated the ground permanently. Her breath was a constant white cloud. Her hands cracked and bled into the clay as she smoothed the inside of the flue, ensuring there were no jagged edges for creosote to cling to and start a chimney fire. Meanwhile, 30 miles down the mountain, Arthur Caldwell was tearing Cora's old bedroom apart. He was looking for the silver watch. Arthur had met with a sleazy local pawnbroker to appraise Thomas Higgins's old belongings. When asked about the Waltham watch, Arthur realized it was missing. Furious, he began digging through old tax records he had stolen from Abigail's lockbox. That was when he found a discrepancy. A tiny county tax receipt from 2 years ago, paid in cash, for a parcel of land in the unorganized territory. Arthur realized immediately what had happened. Thomas hadn't left Abigail the land. He had put it in a trust for Cora, immune to Arthur's marital claims, and timber prices had just skyrocketed. That 40 acres was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to the commercial logging companies clear-cutting the lower valley. All he needed was the original deed and Cora's forged signature on a transfer of rights. Arthur loaded his hunting rifle, packed a heavy coat, and pointed his truck toward the logging roads of the Bitterroots. Up on the ridge, the sky turned a bruised, ugly gray. The birds went completely silent. Cora recognized the signs of a massive pressure drop. The first true blizzard of the season was hours away. She had just placed the final capstone on the chimney the day before. The clay was mostly dry, but she hadn't tested it yet. If she lit the fire and the chimney failed to draft, she would have to sleep without heat. In the incoming storm, she would freeze to death by midnight. As the first heavy, wet flakes of snow began to spiral down from the canopy, Cora knelt on the packed dirt floor of her tiny cabin. She arranged dry pine needles, a handful of birch bark she'd hoarded, and a teepee of seasoned split wood inside the deep stone firebox. Her hand shook as she struck a wooden match against a rock. The sulfur flared, casting dancing shadows against the fresh pine walls. She touched the flame to the birch bark. It caught immediately, burning fast and bright. Cora held her breath, watching the smoke. For 5 agonizing seconds, the smoke curled outward, creeping toward the cabin room. Panic seized her throat. She had built it wrong. The math was wrong. She was going to die here. But then, a physical whoosh echoed in the firebox. The heat hit the carefully angled throat of the chimney, breached the smoke shelf, and caught the upward draft. Suddenly, the smoke snapped backward, drawn fiercely up the stone flue. The fire roared to life, feeding on the oxygen, pulling the cold air from the floor and blasting radiant heat into the tiny room. Cora collapsed onto the floor, laughing hysterically, tears finally spilling hot down her freezing cheeks. The chimney worked. It was drawing beautifully. The stone began to warm, acting as a massive thermal battery. Outside, the wind began to scream, hitting speeds of 50 miles an hour. The temperature plummeted to 20 below zero, the blizzard burying the mountain in a violent sea of white. But inside, Cora stripped off her heavy jacket. The air, a balmy, bone-deep 70 degrees. She had survived her first major test, but her work wasn't finished. The next morning, with the storm still raging outside, Cora decided to deepen the ash pit at the front of the hearth to make cleaning easier. She took a small steel hand trowel and began scraping away the hard-packed earth beneath the stone opening. 6 inches down, her trowel struck something hard. It didn't sound like a rock. It sounded like metal, a hollow, distinct clink. Frowning, Cora dropped the trowel and used her bare hands to dig away the dirt. Buried precisely beneath the center of her father's original foundation, intentionally hidden beneath the firebox, was a heavy, rusted iron lockbox, and it was padlocked shut. The iron lockbox was heavy, coated in a thick layer of rust and packed earth that flaked away beneath Cora's numb fingers. The heavy brass padlock securing the latch was an antique, thick and unyielding. Cora grabbed the heavy flathead hammer she had used to drive wooden pegs into the cabin joints. She brought it down on the brass curve of the lock with a resounding metallic crack. It took 7 brutal strikes before the brass shackle finally snapped. Cora pried the stiff, squealing hinges open. Inside, wrapped meticulously in layers of oiled canvas to keep out the damp, were 2 distinct items. The first was a series of heavy, tightly bound canvas sacks. The second was a thick, leather-bound ledger, the kind used by accountants decades ago. She pulled the first heavy sack into her lap and untied the rotting twine. A cascade of heavy metal discs spilled onto the packed earth floor, gleaming fiercely in the firelight. Cora gasped. They were gold coins. State: Gauden's Double Eagles, minted in the 1920s. Her father hadn't just been a logger. He had spent his youth panning the forgotten tributaries of the Bitterroot River, quietly hoarding the earth's wealth. There were easily 100 coins here. Even to a 16-year-old with no concept of numismatic value, she knew she was looking at a fortune. But it was the ledger that held the true weight of her father's secrets. Cora wiped her hands on her jeans and opened the crackling leather cover. The pages were filled with Thomas Higgins's neat, cramped handwriting, but it wasn't a diary. It was a meticulous record of financial transactions, dates, dollar amounts, and shipping manifests from the Coeur d'Alene lumber mill where Thomas had worked and where Arthur Caldwell had been the regional manager. As Cora read by the flickering light of her stone chimney, a sickening picture began to form. Arthur had been embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from the mill, skimming off the top of commercial shipments and falsifying the books. But the most horrifying revelation was detailed on the final page, dated exactly 1 week before her father's death. "Arthur knows I found the discrepancies," the entry read, the pencil lead pressed so hard it tore the paper. "He threatened Abigail today. He told me if I go to the police, he will ruin her. I am transferring the Miller's Ridge deed to a blind trust for Cora tomorrow. If anything happens to me in the timber tomorrow, it wasn't a felled tree. It was Arthur. He tampered with the winch cables on the skidder. I saw him near the machinery, but I can't prove it yet. I need to get the girls out." The breath hitched in Cora's throat. Her father hadn't died in a tragic logging accident. Arthur had murdered him to cover up his theft. And then, like a parasite, Arthur had manipulated his way into the grieving widow's life, marrying Abigail to ensure the stolen money he had hidden in her bank accounts remained under his control. A sudden sharp crack echoed from outside, cutting through the howling wind. It wasn't the sound of a freezing pine branch. It sounded like a gunshot. 3 miles down the ridge, Arthur Caldwell was losing his battle against the mountain. His heavy Ford truck had high-centered on a massive snowdrift an hour ago, forcing him to abandon it. He was now trudging through knee-deep snow, his face wrapped in a wool scarf, his hunting rifle slung over his shoulder. He was fueled entirely by a toxic cocktail of rage and desperation. The commercial loggers were ready to buy the unorganized territory, but they needed clear title. If Arthur didn't get that deed from Cora, the bank would foreclose on the house, and his gambling bookies from Spokane would come breaking his legs. He had wildly underestimated the Bitterroot winter. The temperature was 20 below zero and dropping. Frostbite was already creeping into his toes, and the wind chill felt like a physical assault. When he saw the faint orange glow of wood smoke cutting through the whiteout conditions ahead, a cruel smile cracked his freezing lips. He fired a warning shot into the air just to let her know he was coming. Inside the cabin, Cora scrambled to her feet. She shoved the gold and the ledger back into the iron box and kicked it beneath the heavy shadows of her cot. She grabbed her father's broad axe, the hickory handle smooth and reassuring in her grip. She had built this cabin to withstand nature. Now, she had to see if it could withstand a monster. The heavy oak door rattled violently on its leather hinges. "Cora!" Arthur's voice was barely a croak over the screaming blizzard, muffled by the thick, mud-chinked logs. "Open the door, you little brat! I know you're in there! Open it, or I'll shoot the lock off!" Cora stood in the center of the tiny 10 by 12 room, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The fire roared in the stone chimney, casting long, frantic shadows across the walls. "Go away, Arthur." She screamed back, her voice trembling but loud. "I know what you did. I found his ledger. I know you killed him." The silence outside was sudden and absolute, broken only by the shriek of the wind. The revelation hit Arthur like a physical blow. If she had that ledger, she didn't just have the land. She had a life sentence waiting for him. "You're a liar!" Arthur roared, throwing his shoulder against the door. The thick lodgepole pine didn't budge. Cora had barred it with a heavy crossbeam of solid cedar. A deafening bang shattered the air. Splinters exploded from the door as Arthur fired his hunting rifle directly at the wooden latch. The bullet chewed through the pine but embedded itself harmlessly in the heavy crossbeam. "I'm coming in, Cora, and I'm burning this ledger, and then I'm leaving you to the wolves." Arthur moved to the single small window Cora had built. It was covered by a thick piece of oiled canvas and barred with thick branches. He smashed the butt of his rifle against the wood, splintering the makeshift bars. He tore the canvas away, the brutal -20 wind instantly whipping into the sweltering cabin, bringing a vortex of snow with it. Arthur thrust his rifle barrel through the opening, trying to aim at her in the dim light. Cora didn't hesitate. She had a cast-iron pot of snow melting over the firebox. She grabbed the heavy handle with a leather rag, ran to the window, and hurled the boiling water directly at the opening. Arthur shrieked in agony as the scalding water hit his face and chest, instantly freezing into his jacket as he stumbled backward into the snowdrift. He dropped the rifle, clawing at his blistered skin. "You're dead!" he howled, his voice cracking into madness. "I'll smoke you out!" Cora heard the crunch of his boots circling the cabin. Panic seized her as she realized his plan. The walls were wet, raw wood, and wouldn't catch fire easily, but the chimney, the stone, was hot. If he blocked the flue, the cabin would fill with carbon monoxide and smoke within minutes. She heard him grunting, trying to climb the rough, saddle-notched logs at the corner of the cabin. Cora grabbed her father's axe and stood beneath the chimney throat. She could hear Arthur's heavy boots scraping against the icy cedar shakes of the roof. He was dragging himself toward the stone stack, intending to stuff his heavy coat or branches down the opening. "Arthur, stop!" Cora yelled. "The roof is covered in ice." It wasn't a warning born of compassion, but of fact. The heat from the cabin had melted the snow on the cedar shakes, which had instantly refrozen in the sub-zero air, turning the pitched roof into a deadly, frictionless slide. Arthur didn't listen. He lunged for the hot stone of the chimney cap. His slick leather boots found no purchase on the icy wood. Cora heard a sharp scrape, a frantic scramble of limbs, and then a terrifying scream that was abruptly cut short. A heavy, sickening thud shook the ground outside the cabin. Cora stood frozen, her axe raised. She waited for a minute, then two. The only sound was the roar of the blizzard and the crackle of her fire. Carefully, she unbarred the door and cracked it open. The wind nearly tore it from her grasp. Lying in the snow, 10 feet from the cabin walls, was Arthur. He had fallen directly onto the frozen stump of a felled pine. His leg was bent at a grotesque, impossible angle, and he was unconscious, his breath coming in shallow, ragged white puffs. The cold was already claiming him. If she left him there, the Bitterroot winter would do to him exactly what he had intended to do to her. It would be a clean, untraceable death. Cora stared at the man who had ruined her life, who had murdered her father. The hatred in her chest burned hotter than the fire. But she thought of her father, a man who built things, who left her a legacy of survival, not murder. She dropped the axe. Grabbing the heavy toe straps she had used to drag logs, she waded into the freezing snow. She wrapped the canvas around Arthur's chest and, using every ounce of strength she had left, dragged his heavy, unconscious body into the cabin. She didn't put him near the fire. She left him in the furthest, coldest corner of the room, binding his hands and his broken leg tight with rope so he couldn't move when he woke up. He would survive, but he would suffer. For the next 2 days, the blizzard raged. Cora sat by the fire, reading her father's ledger, while Arthur drifted in and out of a feverish, agonizing consciousness, realizing he had lost. When the storm finally broke on the third morning, revealing a brilliant, blinding blue sky over Miller's Ridge, Cora packed her backpack. She loaded the gold, the ledger, and her father's silver pocket watch. She hiked the 30 miles down the mountain, straight to the county sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody listened to the 16-year-old girl in silence. When she handed him the ledger, his face went pale. Within 3 hours, a search and rescue team on snowmobiles reached the cabin. They found Arthur Caldwell exactly where Cora had left him. Arthur was sentenced to 25 years in the state penitentiary for embezzlement and the second-degree murder of Thomas Higgins. Cora didn't sell the land. Using the fortune in gold coins, she hired a crew to properly finish the cabin, expanding it into a beautiful, sprawling timber frame home. The original stone chimney remained in the center of the house, a monument to the 16-year-old girl who had faced the brutal winter and a ruthless predator, and refused to break. If Cora's incredible fight for justice and survival left you breathless, smash that like button. What would you have done with Arthur in the freezing snow, leave him to the wolves, or drag him inside? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to share this incredible true crime survival story with your friends and subscribe to the channel for more epic tales.